All right. Hey, welcome to the Social Thread podcast. My name is Robert Payne. I'm the Community Development Director here at Social Thread. Social Thread is a nonprofit that helps people to thrive and belong and explore their faith on their own terms in community. And today with me, as always, is
Rob Reinders, the founder of Social Thread.
awesome. And we have an amazing guest today, Micah Bournes. How are you, my friend?
Pretty good. I'm sorry I did not correct you before we started recording, but my last name is actually pronounced Bournes. It's all good. The S is silent. It's
Bournes. Micah Bournes.
I meant to say something earlier, Doc.
Okay.
Let's record that again.
Leave it in there. Let's keep it real.
All right.
Clearly, we're best friends. We go way back.
Indeed. So yeah, and no one has ever made the reference to Bournes identity, right? Bournes identity.
All the time.
Awesome. Well, Micah, you have an amazing career as a poet and a musician, and so I'm just wondering if you could just give us a quick background of your story and your journey.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Long Beach, California. Growing up during the 90s, it was kind of, Long Beach was a hub for the hip hop community at the time. A lot of the most successful artists were coming out of Long Beach and Compton, which is a city that just borders us on the north. And so I, from a very young age, was just enthralled with hip hop, and specifically since some of the most successful artists were coming from my city and went to the schools that I went to, you know, Snoop Dogg, Nate Dogg, Warren G, Dr. Dre, like all these cats were from the neighborhoods that I was in and around. And so that made a big impression on me as a kid and as a teen. And I just fell in love with it. But the interesting part was I was raised in the church. I saw my interest in hip hop as somewhat of a guilty pleasure. It was something I wasn't supposed to like because of the stereotypes about hip hop. And also when it comes to poetry, like I make music and I do poetry, but people more know me as a poet. The most hilarious thing was I thought I was not into poetry at all whatsoever because I was only exposed to a particular type of poetry in school. I thought poetry was either super old school Shakespearean, or if it was modern poetry, it was like really abstract. And it was almost like the more confusing it was, the more poetic it was, you know? That was my stereotype about poetry. And I didn't see myself in it. You know, we studied Shakespeare, we studied Robert Frost, we studied Emily Dickinson, a bunch of old dead white people. And to be young kids of color from the inner city, having to read these poets from a different time and a different culture and just not seeing yourself in it at all and not understanding the language, not understanding the references, I just thought, man, this junk just ain't for me. And it wasn't really until college. I loved music growing up, but I never, my family was more of a sports family. I played a lot of everything. I played basketball, soccer, football, all these things. But college is when I started experimenting with my creativity, and kind of retrospectively, once I got more into poetry after being invited to an open mic where cats were doing spoken word poetry, I'm like, oh, snap. I've actually loved poetry my whole life, but the poetic expressions in our culture were not seen as legit. I think about hip hop. I'm like, oh, I just liked rap music and I'm not even supposed to like it being a church kid. But now that I have all the language of the writing community, I'm like, I didn't just like these cats because they were dope rappers. I appreciated them because they employed all these poetic devices. They used, you know, double entendres and metaphors and similes and alliteration. And I know now, and I'm like, man, I've appreciated that aspect of hip hop. It wasn't just the beats, it was the lyricism, it was the poetic prowess of rappers. So yeah, and I don't know, I've had an interesting relationship with the poetry community and academia as a whole, because it wasn't just when it came to poetry. A lot of expressions of my intelligence were more creative. And so growing up in kind of traditional public school, to me, being smart meant to be good at math and science and reading. And those were all things that I struggled in. But nobody told me that, you know, my interest in hip hop, my interest in creative things was an expression of my intelligence, that I had something to offer. So I spent almost my whole education, college included, thinking I was stupid because I wasn't good at what I believed you had to be good at in order to be smart. And so even when I started writing, I kind of separated it. I started with hip hop and I didn't even see that as writing, because in my head it was rapping and that was different for whatever reason. And then when I got into poetry, it was like spoken word performance poetry. So still, it was kind of like, well, this has nothing to do with academia. This has nothing to do with school. School makes me feel dumb. School reminds me that I'm not good enough, that I don't understand things. But these creative things, I remember when I first started going to open mics and people were like, man, you're so smart. It was weird to me. I'm like, smart? What are you talking about? Like, I'm just spitting poems. I'm just spitting rhymes. This has nothing to do with being smart. So yeah, I had a lot of growing to do, but that's kind of like how I got into it. And in relation to, you know, I know people know me as an artist who speaks a lot about justice issues, but that wasn't intentional either. When I started writing, I was just writing about my life, but I happened to be a young Black male in America. So when I begin to write about my life experiences, even when I'm not trying, at some point it's going to start to speak to issues bigger than me, as I'm navigating how people see me and how I'm treated by different folks and all the experiences I'm having in everything from school to personal interactions. So yeah, it was kind of by default. That was another thing that I didn't realize until I started going to open mics. People would come up to me and be like, man, I love how you talk about justice issues. Can you come speak at our, like, you know, social justice event? And I was like, social justice? I mean, I heard of the term, but I didn't really know, like, I wasn't on that. I was like, I'm just rapping. I'm just spitting poems. And, but I realized, oh, I guess I am speaking to these things. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that I want to ask, and so I may circle back to a few things that are in that you brought up, but let's jump right into the social justice and the things that are just coming out for you naturally. Can you kind of give us a overview when you say you're talking about injustice? What are some of the issues that you're trying to address that's coming out of you naturally into your poetry?
Yeah. Again, it wasn't like, now at this point in my career as an artist and a writer, I definitely tackle it more intentionally at times. But most of the time, even still, I just write what I see. And I think, especially when it comes to white folk, there is just this assumption that their perspective is kind of neutral, that almost whiteness is the absence of culture and the absence of bias, and it's not true. And so I kind of bring that to light by just pointing out these things that we think are not biased and are just neutral. Here goes my perspective, and maybe in showing you that, you'll see that your perspective is also biased. Like, one of my earliest spoken word poems that was one of my more popular pieces was titled Normal Hair. And it was written after I was staying at a friend's house, a white friend. And at the time, I have like locks now, but I had a big afro. And I was just taking a shower. I went to wash my hair with his shampoo. And I picked up his shampoo, and the bottle said, for normal hair. And I thought to myself, well, what the heck does that mean? You know, with all the different hair textures and types in the world, how can any product be labeled for normal hair? Who gets to decide whose type of hair is normal, right? So again, I wasn't like, I'm going to address racism. I'm just like, I looked at the shampoo bottle and I thought, what does this mean? And so I wrote about it. And I ended up later looking up that it was Garnier Fructis. I looked up that company, and they had another type of product, which was more formulated for Black hair. But the description on that product said, for dry, frizzy, unmanageable hair. Now, dry and frizzy are just descriptors, but unmanageable and normal, those are judgment calls, right? I'm like, I mean, my hair is dry and frizzy, but I have managed it just fine my whole life. You know what I'm saying? Like, so if your hair is straight, it's somehow normal. And if your hair like stands up and is fuller, then it's unmanageable. What are you talking about? Like, you're biased, right? And so it wasn't like I'm going to tackle racism and institutional racism and white supremacy. That's white supremacy. But I really was just writing about a shampoo bottle and thinking about how every single one of my brothers and sisters got hair that is normal to me, you know? So, but I am speaking to white supremacy. I'm speaking to the assumption that whiteness is the correct way to exist as a human, right? But it's a bottle of shampoo, and it's woven into everything from politics all the way to shampoo bottles. So that's what I mean when I say it wasn't intentional. It wasn't like I'm sitting down to tackle these things. It's like, I can't even take a shower without being confronted with the fact that my country and culture sees me as not normal, as unmanageable for things I didn't even choose, right? So that's it. How do you get messages like that from at every level of society, from important things, from textbooks to shampoo bottles, without having an identity crisis, without wondering if maybe you are inferior? That is the experience of every person of color, and especially Black people in America. And people just don't see that. They think, oh, this country's not racist. What are you talking about? You know? And I'm like, y'all have no idea. So, yeah.
Well,
one of your most powerful poems that I listened to on your website was Manna. And I think speaks to, again, another example of you just speaking your story and pointing out that experience and these injustices that they're just there. And in, the 2.5-minute poem, you talk about food insecurity, and so many other issues. And I don't know, can you talk about like that process of when you're going to write a poem and you think about your experience like that? How does that come together? Because I think just telling your story, like you said, it's so powerful, and you can say so much in so few words.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the power of art, but specifically poetry. It's like, you, in a poem that sometimes reads in less than a minute, especially if you're talking about poems for the page, that sometimes it'll just be 2 little clusters of words, 2 little stanzas. You're done with it in 30 seconds, and your heart went on an emotional roller coaster, but that poem that you're talking about is, I'm literally writing about a like very brief conversation I had with my mother after we drove by a McDonald's that closed, a McDonald's we used to go to as a kid. And without getting into the specifics of that poem, the concept of, I think when it comes to whether you're an artist or you're trying to say something in some other form, a speaker, a preacher, writing a novel, whatever, whenever we want to say something profound, I think the assumption is that we have to dig into these extremes in life. So whether you're talking about cloud 9, high in love, or the depths of pain after, a breakup or a death in the family or a failure. I see this quote that's thrown around, and it's attributed to so many people. But it essentially says, writing is easy. You just sit down and bleed onto the paper. Different variations of that. But I don't actually agree with that. I think that some of the most moving and profound things that I've written, and also that I've experienced from other people's art, comes from observing life, which many of us would consider mundane, right? Again, one of my most popular poems, From a Bottle of Shampoo, from a conversation with my mom about a McDonald's. It's not about, I mean, I have had these extreme experiences, right? Where I've come face to face with vicious racists. But I've also just picked up a bottle of shampoo and felt like, oh, once again, I don't belong. So I think a lot of people approach creativity like this force that comes upon you, like this lightning bolt or light bulb of inspiration, and you got to just capitalize off of it when it comes. And I think of it very differently. I think of it more of a discipline that every single day you're going through life and you're just observing, and you have no clue how deep these seemingly unimportant things might be once you actually follow that thought. It's as cliche as it is, it truly is a stop and smell the roses. Sometimes things that I expect to inspire me don't. And then I find inspiration in the most everyday. One of my favorite, there's been a couple books that really influenced my creative process, but one of them is called Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Reich. And he's going off one time about inspiration, but he does it by talking about the city of Rome. And he goes, Rome, if you have not yet been to it, makes you feel stifled with sadness for the museum-like atmosphere that it exhales. He goes, all of these ruins, which are laboriously held up by historians, mean nothing, are nothing, and have no heart and no value. And then after that rant, he says, and yet there is much beauty here, because everywhere there's much beauty. What is his point? Rome sucks. If you want to go on vacation, go to Paris. No, his point is Rome is no more or less inspiring than a cornfield in Nebraska, than a suburb, than an inner city, than any place on planet Earth where you just observe human life. Yeah, nature is beautiful, Rome is beautiful, but so is the city, and so is any place in the universe that you're taking the time to sit and see and hear and smell and take in. And so, yeah, I think of creativity more as a discipline. And even when I don't feel inspired, to just observe life, go through life a little bit slower. And you never know when something good will come.
I think our listeners and the people that are a part of Social Thread, a lot of times they're wanting, they're wanting to get past that bias, whatever that is, and they're recognizing that. And so, I was wondering if you could say, hey, what would you say to some people who genuinely want to listen, want to be involved, want to be a part of healthy conversations, be a part of solutions? What would you say to people like that?
I would say, first of all, I think one of the biggest obstacles to really being a part of the solution is people don't want to admit that they are part of the problem. All of us are, but especially white folks. Again, they don't want to admit they're biased. They don't want to admit that they're racist. They think about it as a heart condition. And so they're like, well, I don't hate anybody, and therefore I am not racist. I'm like, you don't have to hate people to have prejudice ideas, to have racist ideas that have been ingrained in you from birth. Like, again, there's no way you're not racist. I'm racist. You know what I'm saying? I have racist thoughts. Black people think poorly about other Black people because of the culture that we grew up in, just like y'all, right? And so I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that we all have work to do, and there is no shame in that. That's just the reality. So sure, yes, okay. Instead of just insisting, I think that's one of the biggest things. I want to help, but I'm not part of the problem. I guess you are, and that's fine. We all are at different places on the journey. I think, as Martin Luther King often would say, the extremist, the really radical racist is not the problem. The problem is the moderate. The problem is people who want solutions, but also want to remain comfortable. Also don't want to do that much work, make that much sacrifice, whether that sacrifice is financial, whether that sacrifice is intellectual or listening to other people. spending time reading books, just a time sacrifice of educating yourself. I don't want to be racist, but I really am not trying to read all this stuff. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, your whole life, you've been educated by a particular perspective. And if you are not intentional about undoing that, then you are going to remain thinking the way you think about stuff. And I really don't think people understand how deep this goes. People really think, oh, look, we're eating at the same restaurants now. We've had a Black president. We're good. And I'm like, it is so deep, not just currently, but I remember for me, I don't know why this, I don't know. This was one of those moments in my education. It was after college. I'd already graduated. And I had started to become skeptical of most things I was taught about anything in America in public school. And so I started to do my own reading, right? And I'm like, I'm going to read exclusively people of color writing about things that I care about, whether that means theology, whether that means history, social justice. I've heard so many perspectives from white folks and the authors of the textbooks. And so I'm going to get a different perspective. And so I started reading a lot of people of color. And one of the persons I read was Frederick Douglass. He wrote 3 different autobiographies for a reason I won't get into. But I remember while reading his autobiographies, I had a moment where I discovered something that really angered me. America gives us the narrative they want us to have. And when it comes to Abraham Lincoln, he's seen as a hero. Everybody likes him. As a Black person, we're supposed to be forever indebted to him. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln believed in equality. It's not true. It's just not. Abraham Lincoln told Frederick Douglass to his face that he thought Black people were inherently inferior to white people, and he didn't believe they should be slaves, but they would forever be a servitude race, not as slaves, but they would be the butlers and the maids because they do not have the intellectual capacity that white people have. That's what Abraham Lincoln said. He was flat out racist. He thought we were inherently inferior. I'm reading this in a conversation that Frederick Douglass is having with Abraham Lincoln himself. Elsewhere in that, they made reference to this thing that I ended up looking up. When Abraham Lincoln was running for president, one of his critics said, don't vote for Abraham Lincoln because he believes in equality and he believes Black people are equal to white people. And Abraham Lincoln defended his honor. It was to, I think, Horace Greeley, what it was. He wrote a letter. And he wrote a letter defending his honor and saying, I do not believe in equality. This is what he said. He said, what I believe about slavery, I believe only in as much as it preserves the Union. He says, if I could preserve the Union by not freeing a single slave, I would do that. If I could only preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. If I could preserve the Union by freeing some slaves and leaving others in bondage, I would also do that. My chief aim is to preserve the Union. That's all he cared about, nationalism. The only reason he became adamantly against slavery is because he believed that as long as it existed, we keep fighting over it. And he was right. And so he did become very abolitionist, but not because he loved Black people, not because he believed we were equal. So, and this is literally common knowledge that he wrote this letter and he published, and he sent it. It's like, it was accessible information. Never seen that in any textbook I ever read. We were told Honest Abe, right? We're told to admire this person who thought we were inherently inferior. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, this happens everywhere. It happens in history class. It happens in your churches. It happens everywhere. And so it's like even your heroes are just, as a Black person, how am I supposed to like admire or be proud to be an American when all these American heroes didn't even believe I was human, I was equal? And so again, it's like I've gotten in conversations with people like Abraham Lincoln was amazing. I'm like, you clearly ain't read nothing you've read only the textbook you had in high school. You know, like this is not some super pro black conspiracy theorist, the white man's the devil. No, this is just the truth that you were not taught, because you were taught a narrative that was most convenient for the powers that be.
You mentioned what we're being taught in our churches. Where do you see faith communities or people of faith, people who practice spirituality, who are making progress on issues of race and justice, and where areas where we still have a long way to go?
Yeah, I think faith is the same, has the same problem. A lot of faith communities, white people, when they think about theology, they talk about their theology as orthodox theology, right? They think they have no bias. I went to Bible college, predominantly white Bible college. Almost all of my professors were white men. Almost all of the textbooks, the authors, the theologians we studied were white men, both current and historically, you know. And again, I tell folks, imagine, and it's not that I didn't learn anything that I admired, you know, or thought was true, but, you know, we're always, you know, studying Spurgeon and Tozer, and I could go on and on. I got a whole list of white theologians that I admired. But fact of the matter is, I said, imagine if you went to a Bible college, and my freshman year, I stayed in a dorm that was 19 stories high. There was 30 guys on each floor. It was my floor, the 6th floor. It was me, 1 Asian, and 28 white guys, right? And that was typical. Most of the classrooms I was in, I was usually the only black person, sometimes the only non-white person. But I say, imagine if you went to college or a church, or you had a theological education where 90% of the books you read were written by Asian women. Christian women who weren't writing about Asian issues particularly, but still 90% of the books of the theological books you read, 90% of the sermons you heard, 90% of the professors you had, 90% of your classmates were Asian. You would be like, what kind of Bible college is this? Is this like Asian Bible College of America? No, like it would be overwhelmingly clear to you that even if they weren't trying to have a bias, whenever you have that extreme imbalance, you're going to be receiving a particular perspective. And the problem isn't that white people aren't allowed to have a perspective. The problem is they will not acknowledge it. They will not acknowledge it as biased and affected by their culture. They insist that this is the normal, orthodox way of looking at the Bible, of interpreting scripture, of living out faith. And so I think, again, you have to acknowledge that I think a lot of people are like, oh, this isn't about race, you know, this is about truth. But you interpret the truth of scripture through your cultural lens. And so, therefore, you can't just say this is unbiased, orthodox, neutral truth. It's not, because I guarantee you, if I went to a Bible college and had all black professors and read all black theologians, I would have learned something different. And how is it in a nation that so many people identify themselves as Christians? You know, the history of the white church in America, you have people Sunday morning preaching sermons and Sunday afternoon wearing KK hoods and lynching people and inviting the kids out to the barbecue when they burned a black body. That was the Christian faith. But you know what was also the Christian faith? The Civil Rights Movement, which was a very religious movement. Martin Luther King's organization was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Most of the pastors in there were black, some of them were white, but they were all people who looked at theology through a different lens. And that lens affected the way what happened in their faith lives and in their faith communities. They looked at it through a black lens. And so when you look at scripture and you hear Bible through a black lens, through a black American lens, through a descendants of slave lens, through slaves themselves when they heard it, what are you drawn to? You're drawn to what you see of yourself in these stories. And you see that the slaves in Israel were crying out and God heard their cry. And you see yourself in it and you say, oh, wait, God hears the cries of slaves. God doesn't like oppression. You're drawn to when you see yourself in it. And so you say things, you emphasize what Black Christianity has emphasized. You know, to follow Jesus, to follow God is to be for the poor, to set the captives free. You know, to the least of these will inherit the kingdom of heaven. That's us. We're the least of these. We're the poor. We're the oppressed. We saw ourselves in that. What is the emphasis in white theology? White people have a lot of guilt. The emphasis in Black theology was communal. It was this communal pain of oppressed people. White culture in general in America tends to be more individualistic. And also there's a lot of white guilt. White people, again, are very concerned about they themselves as individuals not being racist. I'm not a racist. I'm not part of the problem. And so what does the theology emphasize? The individual. The salvation of the individual, no matter what you have done. If you give your life to Jesus, you are free from your sins. You will go to heaven when you die. You will not be punished. Your hands are clean. There is no blood on your hands. And the problem is sin, and the answer is Jesus. And if every individual person gives their life to Jesus, we all good, end of story. And the problem in the world is sin. And so when you emphasize that individual specific one-on-one relationship with God, it's often at the expense of the communal corporate responsibility, right? And so again, these are lenses. And again, I don't think it's wrong to have a theology that stresses the importance of an individual spiritual life. But it is wrong when you say it so much so, and you emphasize that so much so that you say, I'm not responsible for my nation. I'm not responsible for oppressed people groups because I, as an individual, my heart is pure. That's just, again, these are different things that we emphasize because of our cultural lens, because of our cultural guilt and our cultural needs. And again, the spiritual needs in white culture and Black culture are different. And so anyways, but again, you won't be able to recognize any of this if you insist that your theology is not at all affected by your culture. If you refuse to admit that, then you're not going to see these things, you know?
So Micah, you have a new book coming out. It's called Here Comes This Dreamer. Can you tell us the inspiration behind this project?
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of performing spoken word performance poetry for a decade now, but this is my first book, and some of my spoken word pieces I've kind of changed a bit for the page, but most of it is new material, and the theme of it, it's a bit facetious, to be honest. I actually hate the term dreamer. I hate it because culturally, I think it's used in a way that's a bit derogatory when it comes to artists. A lot of people think about artists as these dreamers that are detached from reality, right? You know, when you're talking about wanting to, I don't know, be a doctor, be a lawyer, be something that people think is a more like solid, respectable profession, no one talks about that in a way that is disrespectful. It's, oh, good for you. You know, you're going to go to college, you're going to apply to law school, you're going to take steps to work towards your goals. But if you want to be a creative, right? Oh, you're chasing a dream. You know, you're a starving artist. Someone who's in law school broke because they had to take out a bunch of loans to pay for law school. Nobody calls them a starving lawyer, right? like you don't. You're like, they're in law school. Of course they're going to have loans. But if you're an artist, oh, you're a starving artist trying to make it, trying to blow up, trying to get famous. You're chasing a dream. It's cute. Like, we respect art and beauty on a certain level. Like, it's good, it's nice, but we don't see it as essential. And so, yeah, I hate the language that we have around creativity and around dreaming. Again, even in education, growing up, you know, creative things were always the electives. They were always the throwaway classes, the easy A's. What really matters is math and science, et cetera, et cetera. So I know in isolation, here comes this dreamer sounds very frilly and fancy, right? Oh, or not fancy, but very artsy, I should say. Like, oh, here comes this dreamer. Yeah. But where I actually get it from is a story in scripture where Joseph's brothers betray him. If you're familiar with the biblical story, he was the favored brother. He had a bunch of brothers who were jealous of him for a lot of reasons. But one of the biggest reasons they were jealous of him is because he had these dreams, which turned out to be prophecies. And he had these visions of greatness in his future, where he would rise to a position that was greater than his brothers, essentially. And they were his older brothers. So there was a whole lot of tension there. But I find it really interesting because they decide that they're going to betray him. They decide they actually were thinking about killing him. They end up selling him into slavery. But as the story goes, it says he's going to meet his brothers in the field. He's walking out. And as he's walking towards them, they say amongst themselves, they say, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw his body into a pit. And so the title itself, Here Comes This Dreamer, sounds pretty. Then you get to the title poem in the book, and I started with that passage of scripture at the top. Here comes this dreamer, ... Come now, let us kill him and throw his body into a pit. And the reason why I chose that as a theme of the book is because that is actually how our culture treats dreamers. And, you know, again, to take it back to the justice conversation, America is lying about how we feel about Martin Luther King. Right now, everyone, universally, liberal, conservative, black, white, most people see him as an American hero. That was not the case. People hated him. The government hated him. They spied on him. People called him divisive. There was cartoons mocking him. That, oh, he calls his protests peaceful, but there's always some type of, you know, people going to jail and, you know, and they have like stuff on fire. And they basically were saying he was an agitator. And what happened? I have a dream. Come now, let us kill him and throw his body into a pit. He was assassinated. And it is legally agreed upon that that was a government conspiracy. Look it up, right? The people in the government were involved in getting him killed, right? So we say we love dreamers and I have a dream and respect him, but really we killed him. And I remember one time I was having a conversation with my mother, and my mother's almost 70 now, but she always had resistance to the work that I do and the things that I talk about. And I couldn't understand it because I know as a Black woman, she's experienced these things. And I was like, Mom, what is the problem? Why aren't you supporting me when you know the things that I'm saying is true? And she said, Micah, you already Black. You are a young Black man. People are already afraid of you. Now you got to go around saying all these things that make white people mad. It just feels like you're just painting a target on your own back. And when she said that, I finally understood. I thought she was just being a hater and like, oh, wanted me to have a more traditional job. But no, she, as a mother, she was scared. She is scared. She doesn't like that I talk like this. Because she knows even when I'm not saying this stuff, I'm in danger just because of how I look. And so she was like, I don't want you to talk about these things, because she understands what happens to dreamers, to people who challenge society and dream up a more just and fair world. They are a threat to the powers that be. People who are privileged and wealthy and living good lives now, when you have voices that say, hey, your comfort is at the expense of our oppression, of course they want to silence you. Don't change things, because I might have to give up my position, my comfort, my wealth. And so that's really, the book itself is not only about that. It's about everything. It's literally just about life as a Black person. It's, I think, my most vulnerable. I've put out a lot of albums of poetry and music, but because it's longer, I think it's broader in the sense of often I'll get invited to an event to do 1 or 2 poems, So I'll do 1 or 2 poems, usually something justice or race related. But the thing I like about the book is it gives me the space to just talk about all of life. So the first section is pretty heavily about race. The second section is about relationships, family relationships, romantic relationships, friendships. And then the third section is about spirituality, and my relationship with God, deconstructing my own faith, a lot of what we've been talking about here. But all with the theme of dreams throughout. So like the first section is called Nightmares, the second section is called Daydreams, and the third section is called Prophecies. So yeah, that's what Here Comes This Dreamer is about. It just came out a couple days ago. It is available online. You can get it on Barnes and Noble's website. You can get it on Amazon. It ships internationally to most places. Yeah, I'm really proud of it. But yeah, so that I'm gonna be releasing an audiobook of it later, probably in about a month and a half. But right now it's just the book. It looks just like this. And I'm always working on music too. So I have another music project that I'll be coming out with soon. But I'm kind of all over the place. But yeah, that's what the book is about. So
That's awesome. If people want some more information about what you're doing, how can they get a hold of you and follow you?
yeah, for sure. So everything, I try to keep it simple, is just my name, MICAHBOURNES, MicahBournes.com. You can watch a whole lot of performances of me performing poetry. MicahBournes.bandcamp.com. You can download all of my albums for free. They're also streaming on all the services. You can buy it on iTunes. You can stream it on Apple Music and Spotify. But I always want to keep it there available for free as a resource to people who need it. So my Instagram is just my name, Micah Bournes. And if you dig what I do and you want to support, I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/Micah Bournes. If you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a service where you can support artists monthly at any amount that you like. And you get different perks. So like my book, for example, if you support it at $10 a month or more, my book was on my Patreon, like it's been up there for 6 months, even though it just came out. So Patreon supporters could have read it already. They're going to hear the music before I release it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's pretty cool service. It's kind of a win-win. You support artists that you think are doing good things, and you get kind of some special privileges into their work and their world and their creative process. So yeah, Patreon, Instagram, Facebook, my website, and Bandcamp, all just Micah Bournes. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Hey, we really appreciate you being here with us today, having this amazing conversation.
Yeah. Oh, appreciate it, man. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for all that you do and all your work. Look forward to, anything you put out, man.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, hey, listeners, I hope that you've enjoyed this conversation. Again, you can get involved with Social Thread at socialthread.org. You can also make a tax-deductible donation there, too, under the support tab. And, hey, if you're wanting to get involved in these conversations, I can't tell you one of the best ways to do that is to get involved in community with us here at Social Thread and work this stuff out with people. Say it aloud and say you have to be able to say, hey, I realize I'm biased, but I want to learn and I want to listen. And Micah, I just really appreciate what you have taught us today. And man, it's just amazing stuff. Can't wait to read your book and to re-listen to some of your records. So thanks again, everybody, and we will see you next time.